There's something unsettling about working the night shift during a storm, the way the rain pounds against the windows, the flicker of unreliable lights, and the deafening silence between each distant crack of thunder. It's like the world itself is holding its breath. But sometimes it's not the storm outside you need to worry about. Sometimes it's the basement door that won't stay shut, the mysterious delivery marked urgent, the storm shelter everyone says should stay locked, the unblinking figure staring from the shadows, or the phone that keeps ringing, with no one on the other end except faint breathing. 5 stories. 5 reasons why being alone on a rainy night shift might just be the most terrifying experience of your life. Story 1. The basement door. There's something about an old basement door creaking open by itself that can freeze your blood, especially when you know you locked it. It was a Friday night, and the rain had been hammering against the glass windows of the office building for hours. I was covering a security shift for a co-worker who'd called in sick, and honestly, I didn't mind. The pay was decent, and the place was usually dead quiet at night. The building was one of those late 70s structures with flickering fluorescent lights and carpeted hallways that had seen better days. I was stationed at the front desk, flipping through the pages of an old paperback, half listening to the sound of the rain hitting the glass. That's when I heard it, the faintest creak from somewhere deep inside the building. At first I brushed it off. Old buildings make noise, especially during storms. But then it came again. A slow, deliberate creak, like an old door being nudged open. I grabbed my flashlight, clipped my radio to my belt, and started walking down the hallway. The sound was coming from the far end of the building, near the maintenance stairwell. I felt the chill of the air conditioning as I walked, mixed with the damp smell that always seems stronger during heavy rain. When I reached the stairwell, I stopped dead in my tracks. The basement door was slightly ajar. That door was supposed to stay locked at all times, protocol, no exceptions. I leaned closer, shining my flashlight into the gap, but all I could see was darkness. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the distant rumble of thunder. No response. I pulled out my key ring, finding the heavy brass key for the basement door. I pushed it open just enough to peek inside, the hinges groaning like they hadn't been oiled in decades. A stale, damp smell hit me immediately, like mildew and stagnant water. I shone the light down the stairs. The concrete steps disappeared into pure blackness. I could see the bottom faintly, where the beam of my flashlight cut through the dark. Nothing unusual, still something felt off. I closed the door, turned the key in the lock, and gave the handle a firm tug to make sure it was secure. Satisfied, I turned back toward the hallway. But then, creak. The sound came again. I turned around so fast my flashlight nearly slipped from my hand. The basement door was open again, wide open. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. I took a step back, my eyes fixed on the yawning blackness beyond the doorway. "Is someone down there?" I shouted, trying to sound authoritative. Still nothing. Only the sound of distant thunder rolling overhead. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn around and walk away, I stepped forward and shone my flashlight down the stairs again. This time, I noticed something I'd missed earlier, wet footprints. They started at the bottom of the stairs and led upward, stopping right at the doorway where I stood. The footprints glistened in the light, fresh and soaked through. I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. My radio crackled softly at my belt, but I didn't dare move to answer it. I needed to know what or who was down there. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I started descending the stairs. Each step echoed, bouncing off the damp concrete walls. The farther down I went, the heavier the air felt, humid and cloying, like the storm itself had crept into the basement. At the bottom, I found myself in a narrow hallway lined with old utility doors. Some of them were padlocked shut. Others hung slightly open, revealing dusty shelves and tangled wires. That's when I heard it. A whisper, soft, raspy, just on the edge of hearing. "Help! Me!" My flashlight flickered as I swung it toward the sound. There, in the farthest corner of the basement, crouched a figure. It was huddled in the shadows, its clothes soaked and clinging to its thin frame. Dark, stringy hair obscured most of its face, but I could see its eyes, wide and glistening, reflecting the light back at me. "Hey, are you okay?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't move. It just stared. I took a cautious step closer. "Do you need help? How did you get down here?" The figure's head twitched slightly, like it was trying to process my words. And then, in a voice so faint it barely reached my ears, it said, "You shouldn't be here." My stomach dropped. The flashlight flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, I heard a sound, a wet, slithering noise like something dragging across the floor. When the light came back, the figure was gone. Only a small puddle of water remained where it had been crouching. I didn't wait around. I turned and bolted up the stairs two at a time, my breath catching in my throat. As I reached the top and burst into the hallway, I slammed the basement door shut and twisted the key so hard I thought it might snap. For a moment, I just stood there leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath. The rain still pounded against the windows, and the storm outside showed no sign of letting up. And then, scratch, scratch, scratch. From the other side of the basement door, I didn't stay to hear more. I grabbed my radio and called for backup, my voice trembling as I relayed what had happened. When my relief arrived an hour later, we both checked the basement together. The footprints were gone, the puddle was gone, everything was dry, but the scratches, those were still there. 3 long, deep marks etched into the paint on the inside of the basement door. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw or what was down there, but I'll tell you this, if you ever hear a basement door creak open during a rainy night shift, don't go down there. Would you have gone down those basement stairs, or just walked away? Story 2, The Last Delivery. It's supposed to be a routine delivery, just hand over the package and leave, but not tonight. I've worked the night shift at this warehouse for almost 2 years. It's boring, but easy money. Most nights are the same, scanning boxes, updating inventory logs, and trying not to fall asleep at my desk. But that night was different. The rain had been relentless, drumming against the tin roof and creating an eerie rhythm. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, flickering every now and then. Outside, the parking lot was shrouded in darkness, except for the occasional flash of lightning. I was halfway through a stale cup of vending machine coffee when I heard a truck pull up outside. The screech of brakes cut through the sound of rain, followed by 3 loud honks. It was nearly 2 a.m. We weren't expecting any deliveries. I grabbed my clipboard and hurried to the loading dock. Through the plastic strip curtains, I could make out the silhouette of a man standing next to a large square package wrapped in black plastic. He was drenched, his raincoat sticking to his body, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he was being followed. I pushed open the heavy metal door, letting in a gust of cold, rain-soaked wind. "You're not supposed to be here," I said, squinting against the rain. "We don't have any scheduled deliveries tonight." The man didn't step forward. He stayed just outside the glow of the dock light, his face obscured by the hood of his raincoat. "This is urgent," he said, his voice low and trembling. "You need to take it, now." He shoved a clipboard toward me with shaky hands. His fingernails were dirty, his knuckles pale from gripping the package tightly. "What's in it?" I asked, hesitating. "Just take it," he snapped, "and don't open it." Before I could respond, he spun around, climbed into his truck and sped off, tires skidding across the wet pavement. I was left standing there with the rain soaking the edge of my shirt and the black plastic-wrapped package at my feet. It was heavy, awkward to carry. I dragged it inside and set it down near my workstation. The package had no return address, no shipping label, just a single word scrawled across the top in red marker: urgent. Something about it felt wrong. I sat back at my desk, staring at it while the rain continued to hammer the roof. After a while, I thought I heard something. A faint sound coming from inside the package. A thud. Number, not a thud. It was more like a scratching. I leaned closer, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. It's probably just something loose in there, I muttered to myself. But then it started again, louder this time. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. The sound stopped again, but I felt something else, an odd sensation like I was being watched. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight toward the shadowy far end of the loading dock. There was nothing there, just rows of metal shelves, pallets stacked high with boxes, and darkness. But I felt it, eyes on me, somewhere in the dark. I turned back to the package, my mind racing. The driver said not to open it. But what if there was something, or someone inside? What if they needed help? I grabbed a box cutter and hovered it over the black plastic wrapping. My hand was trembling, but I forced myself to make the first cut. The plastic split with a sharp rip, and a musty metallic smell wafted out. I peeled back the layers, my heart pounding in my ears. When the contents were finally revealed, my stomach dropped. It was empty. There was nothing inside, no cargo, no documents, just an empty box. But the scratching hadn't stopped. In fact, it had gotten louder, and now it wasn't coming from the box anymore. It was coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor beneath my feet. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. The flashlight beam danced across the walls as shadows seemed to shift and ripple just beyond its reach. The sound grew, deafening, frantic, scratch, scratch, scratch. And then, all at once, it stopped. Dead silence filled the air. The only sound was the rain, still drumming against the roof. I took a shaky breath and slowly backed away from the workstation, my flashlight flickering as if it too was afraid. I couldn't stay here. I grabbed the package, wrapped it back up as best as I could, and hauled it toward the loading dock door. I stepped outside, the rain instantly soaking me to the bone. I dropped the package on the ground near the dumpster, watching as the plastic wrap glistened under the dock light. "Stay out here," I muttered, before turning back and slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against the cold metal door, my chest heaving. It was over. Whatever that was, it was out there now. But as I turned around and started walking back to my desk, I froze. Wet, muddy footprints. They trailed from the loading dock door across the concrete floor, winding between the stacks of boxes and disappearing into the darkness of the warehouse aisles. They weren't mine, and they were still wet. I didn't sleep that morning when my shift ended. I didn't even go home right away. I sat in my car with the engine running, staring at the warehouse through the windshield as the rain poured down. I don't know what was in that package, or if there was ever anything inside it at all. But every now and then, when it rains and I hear a faint scratch in the walls, I wonder, did I really leave it outside? Story 3. The storm shelter. They told me to never open the storm shelter during my shift, but the banging wouldn't stop. I'd been working the night shift at this gas station for about 6 months. It's one of those places off a forgotten highway, the kind you only stop at if you're running on fumes or desperate for caffeine at 3 a.m. Most nights it's just me, the hum of the overhead lights, and the occasional car pulling in from the rain-soaked road. But this night was different. The rain had been falling in heavy sheets since my shift started. Thunder rumbled constantly, vibrating the glass doors. Outside, the only light came from the flickering neon sign that barely spelled out "Open." Around 1:45 a.m., the banging started. Thud, thud, thud. It was faint at first, almost masked by the sound of the storm, but it was there, a slow, rhythmic pounding coming from below, from the storm shelter. The shelter hatch was in the storage room at the back of the station, covered by a rusted metal grate and secured with 2 heavy padlocks. It had always been locked, always been ignored. My boss had warned me when I first started. No matter what you hear, don't open it. That thing's been sealed for years. But now someone, or something, was down there. I tried to ignore it. I turned up the radio behind the counter, tried to distract myself by restocking the candy shelves, but the banging grew louder. Thud, thud, thud. It was relentless, desperate, like someone was begging to be let out. I grabbed the flashlight from under the counter and walked to the back room. The air back there felt colder, damper, like the rain had somehow crept inside. The storm shelter hatch sat in the middle of the floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes and rusty shelving. The padlocks were still intact, but the banging shook the metal grate. Dust and grime fell from the edges with every thud. I knelt beside it, shining the flashlight through the gaps. "Hello? Is someone down there?" The banging stopped instantly. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then a voice, small, trembling and muffled, floated up from the darkness below. "Please, let me out." It sounded weak, like whoever it was had been down there for hours, maybe days. But how? The shelter had been sealed for years. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the locks. Every logical part of my brain was screaming at me to walk away. But that voice, it sounded so human. I took a deep breath, pulled the keys from my pocket, and unlocked the padlocks one by one. Each click felt like a mistake, like a countdown to something awful. When the final lock fell away, I hesitated again. "I'm opening it now. Stand back." I grabbed the heavy grate and heaved it open. The air that rushed up was foul, damp and rotten, like something had been festering down there for a long time. I aimed my flashlight into the shelter. At first, all I could see was a set of concrete stairs leading into the blackness below, and then movement. A figure slowly emerged from the shadows, one trembling hand gripping the railing as it climbed upward. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His clothes were soaked and tattered, clinging to his frail frame. His skin was pale, almost greyish, with dark smudges under his eyes. His hair hung in wet clumps over his face, and his lips were cracked and bluish. When he reached the top, he stopped and just stared at me. "Are you okay?" I stammered. "How long have you been down there?" He didn't answer. His head twitched slightly, like a marionette with tangled strings. Then he spoke, his voice low, raspy, and chillingly calm. "You shouldn't have opened it." My flashlight flickered, casting his gaunt face in and out of shadow. His mouth curled into something that was almost a smile, but not quite. And then, as if the storm itself called to him, he turned and began walking, no, drifting, toward the front of the gas station. I followed him cautiously, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Wait! Who are you? Where are you going?" But he didn't respond. He just kept moving, his bare feet leaving wet, muddy prints on the tiled floor. The bell above the glass door jingled faintly as he stepped out into the rain, disappearing into the storm. I stood frozen in the doorway, rain splattering my face as I stared into the darkness. There was no sign of him, no silhouette, no movement. Just the relentless curtain of rain and the faint glow of the neon sign. When I turned back toward the storage room, I froze. The storm shelter hatch was still wide open, the darkness below gaping like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. And then, from somewhere deep below, thud, thud, thud. The banging started again, but this time it wasn't desperate. It was angry. I slammed the grate shut, locked the padlocks as fast as my shaking hands would allow, and ran back to the counter. I spent the rest of my shift staring at the storage room door, waiting for something or someone to come out. When my replacement finally arrived at sunrise, I didn't explain. I didn't say anything. I just grabbed my keys, walked out into the damp morning air, and left. I haven't worked another night shift since. Would you have opened that shelter door or ignored the banging? Story 4. The Watcher. It's one thing to feel watched. It's another to see them watching you. I've been working as a night shift janitor at St. Mark's Hospital for about a year now. It's an old building, half renovated and half forgotten. At night, most of the wards are empty, and the long, sterile hallways feel more like tunnels than hospital wings. It was one of those stormy nights when the thunder seems to shake the walls and the rain lashes violently against the windows. The power had flickered twice already, and I was on the 3rd floor mopping near the pediatric wing. The hallway was quiet, and the faint beeping of a distant heart monitor was the only sound cutting through the hum of the fluorescent lights. As I worked, I happened to glance out the large window at the end of the corridor. That's when I saw him. A figure stood outside in the parking lot, illuminated by the faint orange glow of the street lamp. He was perfectly still, shoulders slightly hunched, face tilted upward, staring directly at me. The rain poured over him, soaking his clothes, but he didn't move an inch. I froze, mop clutched in my hand. Who the hell stands out there in this weather? I whispered to myself. I waved, half expecting him to react, but he didn't. He just kept staring. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself he was probably some poor guy locked out or waiting for someone. But even as I continued mopping, I could feel his gaze on me, cutting through the glass, following every movement I made. After about 30 minutes, I checked again. He was still there. Same spot, same posture, same unblinking stare. Something about it wasn't right. I grabbed my radio. "Hey Frank, you still in the security office?" I asked. A crackle, then Frank's voice came through. "Yeah, what's up?" "There's a guy out in the parking lot. Been staring up at the 3rd floor for almost an hour now. Can you check the cameras?" "Sure thing. Give me a sec." A pause. Then Frank's voice returned, lower this time. There's no one out there, man." I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. "No, Frank, he's right there. Under the street lamp, 3rd row from the building. Listen, I'm looking at the feed now. Parking lot's empty. Are you sure you're not seeing, I don't know, a reflection or something?" I didn't respond. My eyes were still fixed on the window, because the figure was gone. The spot under the street lamp was empty, rain splashing against the pavement where he'd been standing just seconds before. Never mind, Frank. Must have been my eyes playing tricks. I hung up the radio and rubbed my temples. I was tired. The storm was messing with the lights, and my brain was probably jumping to conclusions. But then, from somewhere behind me, down the hallway, I heard a soft squelch, like wet shoes on linoleum. I turned slowly, flashlight in hand. The beam illuminated the end of the hallway, just past the pediatric ward's empty nurses' station. And there he was, the same figure standing at the far end of the corridor inside. He was soaked to the bone, water pooling beneath his feet. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, were locked on me. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "You're not supposed to be here." But he didn't respond. He just turned and disappeared around the corner. My breath came in shallow gasps as I crept forward, flashlight trembling in my grip. The hallway felt impossibly long now, the walls seeming to close in with every step I took. When I rounded the corner, he was already gone. But the wet footprints, they continued down the next hallway. I followed them, my heartbeat thundering in my ears, the storm outside seeming to grow louder with every step. The footprints led me deeper into the hospital, past locked doors and empty wards, until they suddenly stopped, right in front of a supply closet. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed to turn around and walk away. But my hand reached out, trembling, and slowly pushed the door open. The closet was empty, just shelves of supplies and cleaning products. I exhaled sharply, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. But then, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, flashlight darting wildly across the small space. My own reflection stared back at me from a cracked mirror mounted on the wall. But then, slowly, my reflection blinked, and it wasn't me anymore. It was him. The same soaked figure, his unblinking eyes locked on mine through the glass. His mouth began to move, forming silent words. Then the flashlight flickered, and the lights in the hallway outside went out completely. I shoved the door open and bolted down the hallway, not stopping until I reached the janitor's office. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and sank to the floor, gasping for air. The storm outside howled, wind rattling the windows. The power came back on in a flicker, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. I sat there staring at the door, half expecting it to creak open any second, but nothing happened. Eventually, my shift ended. I didn't bother clocking out. I grabbed my bag, avoided every reflective surface, and walked straight out into the rain-soaked parking lot. But as I climbed into my car and glanced up at the hospital's third-floor window, I saw him, standing there, staring down at me. The lights flickered, and he was gone. But even now, I can still feel those eyes, like they're watching me wherever I go. What would you have done? Kept searching, or run the moment you saw him? Story 5. The Last Call. The phone kept ringing, but every time I answered, there was silence, except for faint breathing. I worked the graveyard shift at a call center for a tech support company. It's not the most exciting job, but it pays the bills. Most nights the phones barely ring, and I spend my hours staring at spreadsheets and sipping lukewarm coffee. But that night, it was different. The storm outside was relentless, with thunder growling low in the distance and flashes of lightning briefly illuminating the office windows. The call center is a big, empty room filled with rows of cubicles and humming monitors. At night, it feels hollow, like the building itself is holding its breath. It was just past midnight when the first call came in. The number flashed unknown caller on my screen. I picked up the headset. "Thank you for calling Techline Support. This is Alex speaking. How can I assist you tonight?" No response. All I could hear was faint, raspy breathing on the other end of the line. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I asked again. The breathing stopped and the line went dead. I shook it off. Wrong number, prank call, who knows? I went back to organizing tickets on my screen, but 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same unknown caller. I sighed and answered. "This is Alex with Techline Support. How can I help?" Silence. And then, that faint breathing again. Software slow, almost deliberate. "Listen, if this is a joke, it's not funny. Don't call back." Click. The line went dead. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about the breathing. It felt intentional, like someone was letting me know they were there. Another half hour passed. The storm outside was growing louder, and every flash of lightning cast sharp shadows across the cubicle walls. Then the phone rang again. I hesitated before answering, my finger hovering over the accept call button. Finally, I clicked it. "This is Alex." For a moment, there was nothing but the faint hiss of static. Then a voice, low, guttural and distorted, spoke 2 words. "Alex." I froze. They knew my name. My throat tightened, and I forced out, Who is this? How do you know my name?" Static crackled, and then the voice spoke again. "Look, behind you." The call disconnected. I ripped off my headset and spun around in my chair, my heart hammering in my chest. The cubicles stretched behind me, silent and dark, their shadows deepened by the flickering fluorescent lights. Nothing moved. No one was there. "It's just someone messing with you," I whispered to myself. but my voice was shaking. I glanced at the office clock. 1:42 a.m. Just a few more hours, I told myself. Just make it to sunrise. But then the lights flickered. The monitors went black. The faint hum of electricity vanished, leaving only the sound of rain battering the windows and distant thunder rolling through the sky. And the phone rang again. The glow of the caller ID was the only light in the room, casting an eerie glow across my desk. Unknown caller. I didn't answer it this time. I couldn't. A bright flash of lightning illuminated the office, and for a split second, I saw it. A silhouette. Standing just outside the glass door of the break room, still and unmoving. The darkness swallowed it again as the lightning faded. I stood up slowly, my chair rolling backward with a faint squeak. My breathing was shallow, and every nerve in my body was screaming for me to run. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice barely carried over the sound of the storm. Another flash of lightning lit up the room, and this time the silhouette was closer, inside the office now, just a few cubicles away. I grabbed the heavy office phone and clutched it tightly, holding my breath as I crept backward toward the exit. But then, everything went pitch black. The lights, the monitors, even the faint glow from the streetlights outside was swallowed by the storm. I couldn't see anything. All I could hear was my own breathing and something else. A faint, wet dripping sound like water hitting the carpet. When the lights finally buzzed back to life, I was alone. The cubicles were empty. The glass door to the break room was shut. The silhouette was gone. But there, on my chair, was a single, wet handprint. It was smeared across the fabric, water droplets trailing down to the floor. The phone on my desk began ringing again. Unknown caller. I didn't answer it. I grabbed my bag, shoved it over my shoulder, and sprinted for the exit. The storm slammed against me as I burst outside into the rain, but I didn't stop running until I was in my car with the doors locked. I sat there for a long time, staring back at the faintly lit call center windows, and then, through the glass, I saw the faint outline of someone standing by my cubicle, watching me. The next morning, I quit. I never found out who or what was on the other end of that call, but every time my phone rings in the middle of the night, I hesitate before answering. What would you do if a call like that came through during your shift? Night shifts during storms have a way of warping reality. The rain becomes a steady drumbeat. The shadows stretch just a little too far, and every creak, scratch, or distant whisper feels alive. Whether it's a locked basement door that refuses to stay closed, an unexpected delivery with something wrong inside, a storm shelter hiding secrets that should have stayed buried, the unblinking stare of someone or something watching from the dark, or a phone call that carries a voice you wish you'd never heard. One thing's clear. The quiet moments during these graveyard hours are never as empty as they seem. Sometimes the storm outside isn't the scariest thing you'll face. If you've enjoyed these stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and let us know which one chilled you the most in the comments below. Did you feel the dread of the basement door, the unease of the watcher, or did the last call send a shiver down your spine? And hey, if you've had your own terrifying night shift experience, we'd love to hear it. Send your stories here, disturbingtalesite@gmail.com. Stay safe out there, and maybe avoid answering those late night calls.